Hi everyone, Combination War and Pandemic here, the internet's busiest music nerd, and it's time for a review of this new Beach House album, Once Twice Melody. This, I believe, is the 8th full-length LP from the legendary Baltimore dream pop duo Beach House. Alex Scally and Victoria Legrand are back with what is pretty much their biggest offering yet in terms of size, and instrumentation too. This thing is an 80-minute project with 4 chapters or sides to it, which average out to about 20 minutes each. And as a longtime Beach House listener, it's my expert assessment that this is their most aesthetically diverse project since 2010's Teen Dream. All of the drum machines and sequence drums, live drumming on this project, plus the countless synth patches across this thing, from ethereal chords to very analog and kind of old school bubbly arpeggios, strings, electric guitars, acoustic guitars, lots of vocal effects on some of these cuts too. Beach House is nothing if not consistent, and with fan favorites such as their self-titled and Devotion from back in the day, they forged a super distinct sound that since then they have stuck very closely to. But there are also moments in the duo's catalog where they experiment instrumentally a fair bit, and in a lot of ways I think Once Twice Melody continues on that path as well, but just on a grander scale. There are some spots on this LP where I think some of the experiments don't quite pan out, like the vocoder vocals on Runaway, which I'm still not all that crazy about, as well as the cycling vocal samples of Don't on the track Only You Know, which I think I have warmed up a little bit to, but really the star of the show on this song for me is that huge, thick, shoegazy rush of synths and guitars that are just so heavy and crushing and visceral. Meanwhile, the song Illusion Forever sounds like an experiment in seeing how far you can push reverb without it completely destroying the song itself, which for Beach House is saying something. The sheen and atmosphere on this track is so full, it's so heavy, it's so bright, it sounds the way I imagine being a vampire blasted with all these rays of sunlight must feel, which does distract from the song a little bit in my opinion, but I will say there's nothing else on the record as enveloping as this. There are also a few moments on this LP that I think are maybe a little too typical for Beach House at this point. Through Me, for example, does have some lovely moments in its runtime, but the airy synth chords and hypnotic arpeggios sound almost plain and average in comparison with everything else it shares space with in the first chapter. Plus, that floor tom beat and the lightly droning guitars in the background are a little mind-numbing. I think they make for some of the weaker and muddier crescendos on this LP. Many Nights is almost like an ambient pop lullaby that I think instrumentally could have used a bit more variation, and Hurts to Love, while this track does have some of the more endearing lyrics on the LP, singing about wanting to love past pain and bad experiences and traumas and hurt, the synth and sequence drum combo on this one feels almost like a Devotion throwback, but there's something about it that doesn't really have that same kind of magic simplicity. Could be the subtly psychedelic effects, could be the uptick in tempo. So with a few reservations being stated there, I will say the rest of this track list is pretty great. There is a whole lot of fire on this record, like the stunning instrumental display showcased on the opening title track. The acoustic guitar, strings, and marching drum combo are fantastic. The eerie little vocal harmonies from Victoria buried their way into my head on first listen. Once, twice, melody. And the way the synth arpeggios take over in the second half and move things almost into a prog synth dream pop blend is kind of incredible. Superstar, there is something in my opinion that's very therapeutic about the bareness of this track and the throbbing electronics. Victoria's calm and steady lead vocal builds the song up into, man, just a layer upon layer upon layer of synthesizers and electronics that are just so dense and so fused together. I can't even tell you what's going on. I can't even separate it from itself to pick out each individual sound. Like, am I hearing a bunch of synth layers here? Am I hearing a fucking supernova? Could be either. Then there's Pink Funeral. Why is this one so creepy? This is legitimately the creepiest Beach House song ever. Blue skies turned black behind our back once was a fairy tale, then it all went to hell. With the heavy drums and the dark organ chords, this thing is a dream pop death. ESP, meanwhile, has one of the weirdest and most surreal instrumental palettes on the entire LP. It's like each individual sound isn't existing on the same plane as everything else, from the acoustic guitar to the lo-fi, blasted out but very quiet drum loops, spectral background vocals, watery lead melodies, Victoria's vocals sounding very just toned down and somber through the whole thing. Again, it's really surreal how it all comes together, and this is, I imagine, how my brain might make up instrumentation in my head while I'm sleeping. Then there's New Romance, which might be my favorite cut on the second chapter. The instrumental layering on this one is so dense and full and orgasmic. The song has this perfect cut-off ending. I'm not usually a big fan of cut-off endings, but it just kind of suddenly ends at a point that feels like I'm just being blasted with this beautiful rush of instrumentation, and the moment it disappears, all I'm left with is like that ecstasy of everything that it was like kind of bringing to me up until that moment. The lyrics on the track paint a picture of an exciting new love. Victoria saying, "Last night I'm messing up, now I feel like dressing up," is one of the catchiest and funniest refrains I think she's put together. Then the final moment in chapter 2, Over and Over, is the longest cut on this entire LP. Stands at 7 minutes, and the rush of all of these synth chords, the chord changes that accompany the hook, it's one of the most just gorgeous on-impact moments in Beach House's whole catalog. And after the midpoint, the song just launches into this huge explorative synth odyssey that I get lost in every time. With the song Sunset, Beach House kills it on an acoustic ballad with chords that I could hear Tom Petty crooning over, but instead Victoria sings on top of it like she is a chorus of ghost children from the turn of the century, which I mean in the most positive way possible. Yeah, it's just a very beautiful piece of string-kissed folk. The song Another Go Around runs like a whisper, quiet inner monologue from Victoria, and the more simple approach on the instrumentation allows the lyrics to really hit, describing what feels like this cycle of, I guess, short-lived romantic interests that are there when the one that you need isn't, as Victoria says in the song. There's also Masquerade, which is another cut with a lot of throbbing electronics on it. Some might read it as being a bit of an 80s thing, but it kind of feels like a dead ringer to an extent for The Knife or even like some Fever Ray. So in a way it may be a little too derivative, but the gothic bells go absolutely hard, as do the spine-tingling whispers that Victoria delivers on the hook. And that "Here Tonight, Gone Forever" refrain in the final moments of the song still haunts me. Look, I could keep going through all of these songs individually, but just to put it straightforward, there's a lot of highlights on this thing. There's a lot of fire in the track list. The biggest issue with this thing is really that it's not just an 80-minute album, but it really feels like an 80-minute album. Maybe because that trademark Beach House pacing isn't really doing it any favors, because while this thing is beautiful and does contain some of my favorite Beach House material to date, it is not a breeze. It is not a breeze at all. The record is sectioned out into a double album format, a 4-chapter format. I encourage fans and listeners to approach this thing in whatever way they feel comfortable with, because at least in my opinion, sitting down and listening to all of it in one go, the flow doesn't exactly reward that type of listening experience, I think. As I listen to this project again and again, there doesn't seem to be any kind of guiding aesthetics or sonics to each chapter as well. And I think that's led to a record where the 18 tracks here stand stronger on their individual merits than they do a whole ass 80-minute record. Now, recently when I had a conversation with Alex and Victoria in an interview about this record, they told me, they made it pretty clear that they broke a sweat over the sequencing of this project, but I really don't hear it, which is weird because the massive amount of work they've put into everything else, like, shows instantaneously. So even though I have a massive amount of love for a lot of these tracks, they just kind of run together like a compilation more than an album. I feel as if I could just put this record on shuffle and get mostly the same vibe out of listening to the whole thing. I'll even go as far as to say the closing track, Modern Love Stories, brings absolutely nothing to the table as a finisher. Like, it's not the grand ending that I think it was shooting for, which, impossible task given just how huge everything else on the record is. Which, you know, while it is an issue, I don't think it's the worst issue a project can have. I'm still massively impressed with the vast majority of the songs and the record's runtime in general, and I still think it's exciting to hear the duo experimenting and trying new things after all these years. Yeah, while it's not the most cleanly groomed and cut and dry Beach House record the duo has ever done, it's still one of their boldest albums ever, has some of their best material ever. I guess the biggest argument against it is that they let their ambitions get the better of them ever so slightly. Feeling a light to decent 8 on this one. Tran? Zishin, have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head, it's another video you can check out. Hit that up or the link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Beach House, forever.